I'm Jeff Hoffman, professor in the AeroAstro department. Today, when we hear the name Draper, it evokes images of a splendid building which houses an excitingly productive applied research organization. But 50 years ago, when the Apollo program that we're celebrating today was approaching that climatic first moon landing, the name Draper evoked the image of a man, Professor Charles Stark Draper, who, as you heard from Dan Hastings, led the MIT instrumentation lab, which was part of our department at the time, and he was department head. So before we begin this symposium, where we're going to bring together some of the instrumentation lab engineers who developed the Apollo guidance and navigation system with some of the Apollo astronauts who used and really depended on those systems, we thought it would be nice to hear a few words about Doc Draper, the man, personally, from Professor Larry Young, who, back in the day, was lucky enough to have had Doc Draper as a mentor and, for a time, as an employer. So, Larry.
Thank you, Jeff and colleagues. Let me tell you, compared to being a principal investigator and a crew member, there is a tougher job, and that is following Charlie Bolden. Charlie, you don't make it easy, but I'm delighted to call you a friend. Yeah, in many ways, MIT and Apollo started with Doc. Occasionally, a dreamer with unbounded optimism combines solid science with the skills of a really handyman, and one of the handiest of these people can turn this dream into reality. And certainly one of them was Charles Stark Draper, who we see on the roof of the instrumentation laboratory with the optical and navigation suite that the instrumentation lab designed for the Apollo missions. Now, when we talk about inertial navigation, yes, it's true, the father of inertial navigation was Maximilian Schuler, a German physicist who published the idea in 1923. But the godfather, in the sense the person who pulled together a team and supported them and made it work, was certainly Doc. After his work with the instrumentation laboratory on developing gun sights, which were largely credited with winning the war in the Pacific, Doc recognized that in order to maintain a stable navigation platform for a very long period of time, more than just the maneuvering time of an airplane, he would need to have to reduce the friction and the disturbance torques in the gimbals that supported the gyroscope, which was the stable reference scheme. And with Professor Robert Mueller here in the MIT Aero Department, he incorporated a couple of major new innovations in gyroscopes, which really enabled long-term inertial navigation. First, they took the instrument and they floated it in a fluid. So when G-forces came along, instead of the instrument being forced to the edge of the bearing, it would continue to float neutrally and spin without external and unwanted disturbance torques. And then, when it did move slightly off-center, they realized that they could use electromagnetic forces and have a magnetic suspension which would bring the gyro bearing back to its neutral positions. Well, it's a long story which we don't have time for now, but it succeeded in generating gyroscopes which would drift at only about 1/100 of a degree per hour, and that indeed was the key to what enabled inertial navigation in submarines under the polar caps, airplanes flying across the continent, and enable them to propose, the instrumentation lab, to propose a guidance system which became the Apollo system. Now, Draper's enthusiasm infected students like me, and you see, I found my instrumentation laboratory badge, so if they may let me back in there. His enthusiasm infected students and colleagues alike, and he regularly married hardware to the underlying theory in his lectures and in his discussions. Doc began teaching at MIT in the 30s. He came over here in 1922. By 1951, he was appointed head of MIT's Aero department while continuing, as we heard, to lead the instrumentation laboratory. And that's where I came in. In 1957, 62 years ago, I had more hair. It was brown. I was a senior in electrical engineering here at MIT and needed to write a bachelor's thesis. And the instrumentation lab was the first place to do this. With patient help from an experienced, what Doc would call electronicer, I designed a vacuum tube analog to digital converter for use in navigation systems. After graduating and working for Sperry Gyroscope, which had supported Draper early on, and following a Fulbright in France, Sputnik was launched. And I became a space cadet on October 4th, 1957. I was grateful to be accepted back into MIT. Thank you, Jim Nevins. Brought me back into the instrumentation laboratory and into a program called the Instrumentation Doctoral Program. And in keeping with Doc Draper's legendary record, you know that he had the record for taking more courses at MIT than anyone ever has. That program in instrumentation required that we pass, Charlie, can I use my fingers? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 departmental qualifying exams and two languages. Furthermore, once you got through that, however, you felt reasonably comfortable in the wide range of hardware and instrumentations. And I want to relate just one story about being a student under Draper, and then I'll yield the platform, because it tells more about Doc than it does about me. So I was searching for a thesis topic, and quite by accident, I learned a little bit about the vestibular system, the balance organ in the inner ear. Most of us are familiar with it for motion sickness, but it's our balance mechanism. And I saw the parallels between the semicircular canals in the inner ear and rate gyros, and between the otolith organs in the inner ear and linear accelerometers, and maybe even between the central nervous system and an onboard computer. And I thought this might be a really cool thing to look at for a PhD thesis. I went to see Draper up on the 5th floor of the old shoe polish factory on Albany Street, and there followed the most important hour in my entire educational career. Doc greeted me cordially and listened to my pitch to measure and model human eye movements, the parallels to inertial guidance. And he told me that when he was an undergraduate at Stanford, he majored in psychology, and furthermore, that he knew all about eye movements. And he liked my idea, and he said he would fully support it, both intellectually and financially. He told Professor Win Markey to oversee the use of the instrumentation fund to support me, and he recruited the fantastic Professor Yao-Tzu Lee to give me guidance and adult supervision. My thesis work involving sample data systems was well received. Draper offered me a position which I accepted in the aero department. We began our studies of space motion sickness, which at the time NASA called space adaptation systems, because space adaptation is good and it's the right stuff. But we proceeded to make our mark and flew experiments anywhere from Mir all the way up through the International Space Station. Most important for me, Doc made me his collaborator. Can I see that? Get the next slide up. Let's see, I can do this. Maybe. Doc made me his collaborator on a paper which attracted some attention, both at home and abroad, the roles of men and instruments in control and guidance of systems for spacecraft, by Draper, Whitaker, and Young. And I'll tell you, to have a paper co-authored by Draper in those days was something. He was president of the International Academy of Astronautics. He was well known on both sides of the Iron Curtain, and I was privileged to be recognized as his co-author, given lots and lots of vodka, and welcomed warmly into the international space sphere. Let me tell you that the intimate relationships between the Aero Department and the Instrumentation Laboratory, which began in this period of the late 50s and 60s, continued well into the era of the divestment of the lab and the renaming of the Charles Stark Draper Laboratory, which hurt Draper greatly, but that's another story. I want to close by telling you that we have continued through our laboratory, the Manned Vehicle Laboratory, to train people who went on to fly in space. One of my very first graduate students is my friend Charlie Duke, who you'll hear from a little bit later today. He studied the accuracy of tracking a target light from a moving spacecraft and then tested it on his way back from the moon. Several other students of our lab went on to fly on the space shuttle. I always wanted to go into space. I got as far as being an alternate payload specialist on Space Lab. I did my best to try to get Neil and Buzz, who you see here, to figure out how to let me hitchhike a ride, but I didn't get into space. Neither did Doc Draper. But our laboratories and our colleagues participated in numerous space adventures, from Apollo to the space station, and we here owe the lighting of our fuse to Doc Draper. I'm privileged to have been part of that, and I have to say, thanks, Doc.